I spent a year of my life applying for jobs, interviewing, networking, volunteering, anything you could possibly think of.
Hi guys, Danica here from Multispective, and I'm here to share with you a brand new episode where I interview Tracy McHugh. She talks about her work and her career in the hospitality industry and how negatively impacted it was during COVID. She lost her job and after that had very, very difficult time being able to land herself another job. She talks in great detail about rejection, the impact that it had on her, and the ways that she sort of used and tapped into the confidence side of herself to start and build her own business. In addition to this, she also talks about her love for traveling, several different places that she's been to, things that she learned about herself, about different cultures, and what it means to be a solo traveler. So listen in, stay tuned. Hope you get some inspiration from the episode, and definitely drop a comment below letting us know what you think. Tracy, why don't we start off with you telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I grew up in New Jersey. I was born and raised there and went to school there and then went to college in upstate New York. So kind of stayed within the region for my first 22 years of life. But I was fortunate during college that I had traveled a bit. I had gone abroad to London as well as Greece for two winter intercession classes. And before then, we had traveled as a family, but it was a little bit more domestically and regionally. But then that kind of led me into I love this and I want to see a lot of different places and understand where, people were coming from and just completely different environments from what I was used to. I was almost seeking out completely different environments from New Jersey and the US and, kind of dabbled a little bit with those classes in Europe and then took me to Asia and South America because I wanted to see existences and places completely different from my own. So kind of tandem led me down a path of an interest, but also career. So I kind of stumbled into that career. I was a typical 22-year-old who wasn't sure what I wanted to do after college and was just taking odd jobs here and there. And unfortunately, I graduated around the 2008 recession. So it wasn't an easy time to get a job. But then, especially with somebody who, didn't have a lot of experience and was right out of college, it was hard to kind of ramp up a career in that and then just fell into the hospitality travel industry. Was working at a hotel in the Miami area. Thought I'd be doing that for about a year, to get some experience, and 8 years later was still in the industry in a sales and event planning capacity. So yeah, so
Yeah,
kind of
no, that's
built
really
a career
exciting.
around an interest that I really love that I happened to
Yeah,
stumble upon taking a
yeah,
class in college. So
yeah. No, that's really cool. And so you mentioned the first place that you traveled to was London, and you mentioned that or England, and it wasn't that different. More in the sense that maybe like the language was the same, and the general. If you understand the language, and everything sort of like generally flows a little bit easier for you. And that there might be some cultural differences, but at the end of the day, you can communicate your way through whatever it is that you need to. Right? Talk to me about the first place that you traveled where you were really in the unknown.
Sure. So I had gone to Europe right after college. So I knew that I really enjoyed traveling and I knew I didn't want to be focusing on a job right away. So I went to Europe for 2 months after college. And stepping back and looking back on it, it was still, not an extreme trip. I didn't go to jungles or anything, super crazy from this tiny town in New Jersey. But I went to 11 countries, and England, Scotland, and Ireland are English speaking countries and, kind of easy for me to navigate on my own. But it was
Yeah.
also around the 2007, 2008. So like while it was easy language wise, I didn't have a smartphone and the closest you could have to a smartphone was a BlackBerry. So like there was no pulling up a map on my phone to like find something or I'm lost or I'm, just going to Google it on my phone and pay the international fees. It was like I'm lost. I need to stop somewhere and ask someone. And I remember when I was in Dublin, I was absolutely lost, had no idea where I was, and I was walking around the Temple Bar trying to make it back to my hotel, and I stopped into a bar, and I was like, "Well, I'm here, I might as well get a drink." So I had, like, 2 drinks, and then finally I said, "How do I get back here?" And the bartender was like, Did you stop to ask for directions and then just start drinking?" Yeah, it seemed like a good good idea at the time, but yeah, so things like that, it wasn't as easy to navigate even if you were in a, English speaking country because you couldn't get yourself out of it with a smartphone. But then there were other countries that I went to that weren't native English speaking countries like Poland and Austria and Switzerland and Italy and stuff like that. But again, those are very Western type countries. So while they weren't necessarily native English speaking countries, it was easy because I was in a lot of the touristy areas. The first time that I really stuck out was when I had gone to Asia in 2017. And so that was the first time that, regardless of whether I was speaking or not, you kind of probably knew that I wasn't from that area. But what was funny about it is growing up in the New York City metro area, you were instilled with just walking around with confidence, whether you know where you're going. So that's
Yeah.
how I always walk. That I would get stopped in like Bangkok to for people to ask me for directions. And I was like, I have no idea where I am. I just got here. So it's funny that,
Yeah.
as long as you're, regardless of what you look like, as long as you're walking around like you know what you're doing, people just assume you do know what you're doing.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. What part of the travels in general did you sort of like enjoy the most that made you want to keep traveling again and again?
I mean, I think it was a little bit of everything, experiencing something new, something different, but, I've traveled a lot of my travels I've done by myself. Some I've done with friends or family members or, in classes or things like this, but a lot of it was just circumstantial where I, wanted to go and I couldn't find somebody to go at the time that I had off, and so I just went, and those experiences are a lot different than when you're traveling with people or a person. When you're traveling with somebody, you're probably focused on that travel and that person, so you're not necessarily engaging with other people as much as you would be when you're by yourself. At least me, I tend to be a people person and I want to have conversations, but if I'm by myself, I, can't always have those conversations. So like I'll look externally, to my surroundings of like who's around me at the restaurant and be open to those conversations. So I would say that one of the things that always sticks out to me from my travels are the times that I've gone alone and the experiences I've had just like randomly meeting people on the journey that I wouldn't have met otherwise. And, people that I just bumped into and they're like, hey, do you want to travel around for the day? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And those conversations I've had and did that in Panama City and met up with a person from I think she was from Germany, and then I did that in Bangkok with a person who was Dutch, so it was, like, just a very interesting experience, it wasn't something was where it was a lifelong connection, but, you got to experience something with somebody else and,
Mm.
kinda hear their story along the way.
When you sort of become a globetrotter, you come across other globetrotters, just by, the areas that you go to and the places that you visit. And then you kind of just come across these amazing stories and inspirational stories of like, other things that people have experienced. And not only do you get to sort of see the city in itself in different sort of perspectives, but also stories that you would have probably never heard of, that you can really only hear as a globetrotter, right?
Yeah, and this is a generalization. There are Americans who travel by themselves. I'm not the only one, I promise, but, like,
Mm.
it's not as common of a trend here, a lot of times, people at least people in my circles, they're traveling with their loved ones or friends or family or whoever it is, or at the very least, joining tour groups or things like that. Like, when I say that I'm scrappy and I travel alone, like, I'm not, like, joining tour groups. I'm just genuinely booking, like, a flight in a hotel and, like, just figuring it out along the way,
That's
and
so cool.
it wasn't necessarily, like, a common thing that I would hear people that I knew talking about doing, and then when I would go abroad and have those experience and, meet people from different countries. When I was in Panama, I took this excursion and it was filled with people from different countries, all traveling solo. Like I'm a teacher from, Europe. I have 6 weeks off. I wanted to travel. None of my other
Mm.
friends had that kind of time off or, just
Right.
completely different countries. And it made me feel a little bit more normal, I guess, because like experiencing other people, and I always got that, "Oh, you're so brave for traveling by yourself," and then I was encountering all these other people from different countries, like, Yeah, we travel by ourselves as well, and I'm like, "Yeah, it's not a big deal, right?" Like,
What are some cultures that stood out to you, or cultural practices, behaviors, anything culturally that really stood out to you in all of the places you've traveled to?
I really liked Asia when I went there. I don't know, I just really I love the food. I just connected with a lot of the cultures out there, and I think that I tend to veer towards cultures that are very, very different from my own. So I had gone to Vietnam for a few days with my cousin, and it was completely different than tiny town New Jersey and just,
Yeah.
food, people, everything was night and day, and I really enjoyed that experience, and that's some of the places I enjoyed the most was because it was so different from what I was used to culturally and just like everything about it, food, people.
Mm.
Two of the places that stick out the most was Vietnam and also Colombia. When I went to Cartagena, were two places that stuck out because they were super different from where I'm from originally. But I also went to places in Asia like Hong Kong and Singapore, and they're obviously not the same as the US, but like they're major cities. And Hong Kong, is very British influence, so it's like
Mm.
it could have been London, not literally, but like a lot of the signs were in English, and
Yeah.
so it was a little bit easier to navigate. So while there were definitely cultural differences, it didn't have me completely out of my element because it could have felt like it was New York City, when I was walking around it. So,
Yeah. Interesting. Would you have ever moved to any of these places if you got a chance?
oh yeah, I I have always thought about living abroad, living someplace else, but then I always thought like, economically, getting jobs and things like that. And I've often thought about living, and not that this is super different culturally, but I have thought about living in Ireland for a few years. I just love that country. It was like super laid back. I swear everybody in that country is just very, very funny and friendly and
Yeah.
helpful.
I do travel around like Thailand and Vietnam, and I'm a teacher, so we get the summers and the winters off. So I get to travel quite a lot around Asia. Every time you go to somewhere new, like a new city, there's this feeling of like just I just want to live your life would be so good here.
Yeah.
But of course, the whole excitement of like the new city and the newness of it eventually wears off, and you kind of get back into reality, right?
Yeah, I learned that the hard way because I did that a lot in my 20s where, I moved someplace new. I moved to Miami, I moved to Sarasota, I moved to Los Angeles, and then to your point, like life becomes life at some point when the glitziness of where you are wears off. Like at some
Yeah.
point you just need to get the laundry done and it's Tuesday and you need to, meal
Yeah.
prep or, you have to stay late for work. So like at some point the novelty of the city wears off and the newness of it, and then just life is life where
Yeah.
you are.
Walk me through the career sort of progression for you. You mentioned that you got a job at a hotel in Miami that was offered by a friend, and that was sort of something that you stumbled upon. And the plan was just to experiment with it for a year. What extended the shelf life of this job for you?
Yeah, so I wound up working in operations in a hotel in Miami for just under a year, and at the time, I was just really enjoying living in Miami. I was like, "I like it here," I'm enjoying what I'm doing and my friends and all that good stuff, and so I was like, "This hotel job's working for me, gives me hotel discounts, for when I travel, so I'm like, "That's cool." So then I was like, "Well, let me see if I can, build on this." So then I, kept applying for jobs within the hotel industry and wound up going to more of office type environments. So I was working in sales and then teetered back and forth in my management career between sales and event planning. And yeah, it was just more. circumstantial. Like at some point, I was just kind of like, well, like I love the hotel discounts. Like I know what I'm doing. This is a comfortable environment. Was in hotels for about 8 years before I hopped over to a startup. So I was doing a very similar to what I was doing, event planning and sales, but just switched over to a startup which was focused on office space and event venues. So still
Mm,
similar to what I was doing, it was just the venue was slightly different.
right. That's really interesting. Like working in events within a hotel versus working in events within a startup can be is very, very different. What kind of events were you mostly focused on? Was it like the mice, the business events when you work in the hotels, or was it like wedding events, or did it all sort of just mesh as long as you were in the events department?
Yeah, so I had a little bit of everything. It depended on the hotel that I was working in. One of the hotels that was a little bit smaller didn't have as big of a team. So I was handling everything from those social weddings and parties to like corporate meetings and events and things like that, and every segment in between. But for the most of my career, I was focused a little bit more on corporate event planning. So just companies, whether smaller companies or bigger companies, they would need extra space, or they were having people fly in from all over, and I would specifically plan out their meals and meetings and itineraries and things like that for the actual meeting in our hotels. And then when I went over to the startup and to that venue, again, I was, we didn't say no to any segment, but just based upon our location and the type of venue we had, we were also dealing with a lot of corporate events. So it wasn't necessarily by choice. We were looking for any event that wanted to use our venues. It just so happened that for the most part, it was corporate events. So, and
Right. Yeah.
also it's a quicker turnaround. So as you can imagine with a wedding, a lot of times people are planning weddings 6 months to a year, if not more out, where like
True.
in corporate events, it's usually a quick turnaround. Like if they're planning it 90 days in advance, that's a luxury. A lot of times, you get a call a week or two in advance or a
Yeah.
month in advance. So it's just,
Yeah.
a lot shorter of a shelf life. And it's more sensitive for, social events because it's, obviously, if it's somebody's wedding, it's their special day, so it's personal to them, but it's also their budget, right? Now, some
Right.
people are more affluent than others, so, like, their actual budget may be different even if it's, like, one person's wedding to another person's wedding, but still, it's their money, right? So, like, they're gonna be very invested in it, like, emotionally, where, corporate meetings, you still need to be mindful of budget, but it's not your personal money when you're planning the event. So it's like as long as you're adhering to whatever your budget is, you don't care if the chicken is $15 or $20,
Yeah, exactly.
chickens.
Yeah, exactly.
People tend to be a little bit, less emotionally invested in the logistical things of planning events for corporate. I think that's what's helped with, like, traveling around, working in this type of industry. You meet so many different people, so it's helped me in my professional life, but also in my personal life, because I can talk to grandma about her 50th wedding anniversary, but I can also talk to the CFO about his budget and his, C-level suite meeting. So it's like, it just kind of helps you because, like you said at the front desk, you're running the gamut of every single type of person that you're dealing with, and you do have the social people, so it helps you in life of, like, knowing how to talk to a lot of different people, yes, in different scenarios, but just different people in general, like, those people who are, like, get to the point are probably get to the point even in their personal life, like, I'm a very get to the point sort of person. I'm probably not the person who's gonna be sitting there for 3 hours talking about floral arrangements or, and then there are other people who, they want that connection, and it's like, as the employee, it's like, yeah, I may not personally be the person who wants to be talking for 2 or 3 hours, but I can be. Like, I know how to, you know, change that to the customer that I'm working with or the customer who's like, "Just get me the facts and figures via email, that's in your inbox,
Hmm.
and let's, move on to the next thing."
Yeah. For sure. I think hospitality in that sense is a very good kind of like segue for anyone to kind of understand any kind of customer service, sales, marketing, because it really teaches you not only how to communicate with different kinds of people and different styles of communication and cultures, but also even things like anticipating people's needs.
The first hotel I worked at in operations was a Ritz-Carlton, and so, like, at the time, was I thinking to myself, like, "Who cares if the teacup handles are angled this way or that way? What does it really matter?" And then, like, realize I cannot go to a buffet now or an event or a reception and not judge their buffet. I will
Yeah.
judge it.
Now walk me through that time when things started getting a little bit difficult for you.
Sure, sure. So, I mean, everybody's got a story, right, of trials and tribulations, and I have to say that, in the grand scheme of things, I've been very fortunate in the sense of, there are some catastrophic things that people can go through that I'm
Mm,
fortunate that I avoided a lot of them. For me, those trials and tribulations boiled mostly down to career. So, kind of like I mentioned a little bit earlier. I started my career around the 2008 recession, so it was very difficult for me to find work. Part of it was because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Part of it was because I was inexperienced, and I
mm,
took a little time to travel. And so it was like a culmination of a lot of things. It took me a really long time to find work after college and something that I wanted to build a career on. And it got to the point where I was talking with my parents, and they're like, you're in a fortunate scenario. Like, you need some experience. So start like finding organizations that you would like to volunteer with, whether it was, the Humane Society or, a local theater or something to put on a resume. So I started doing that after college where I volunteered quite a bit. And it was just something that I had stayed with because it was I enjoy giving back. I realize the position that I am in that, there are people, organizations, or situations that are far worse off than I am. So that's kind of how I built up things a little bit. And then was in AmeriCorps for about a year in Miami working for a nonprofit, and that's where I kinda dabbled in sales a little bit as well as event planning, and so it kinda clicked, but not really clicked at that moment. I was still in the phase of like, "Okay, I need a job, whatever that job is." People in my generation, started off their careers in a, recession, and then, what was that, 12 years later, a global pandemic. So, it was like the start of a career was a recession, and then when you're kind of like ramping your career up, a global pandemic hits it and everybody was affected by this, right? It was regardless of industries, you were impacted by this pandemic in one way or another, but especially if you were working in events or the hospitality industry, there were no events. I was very
mm,
fortunate that I kept my job through that and I was furloughed. But it wasn't an easy industry to be in during this time, and there was just a lot of uncertainty in life in general. We kind of thought, okay, the lockdown is up, we're kind of like the vaccine has come out, and all this stuff. So, we're in the clear, so to speak. But since the pandemic, the economy has just been like a roller coaster. We thought like a lot of these big companies, like tech companies, were just immune to any trials and tribulations. And now there's
mm,
last year or so, there's been all these tech layoffs. And I was looking for a job from the beginning of 2023 and
mm,
applying. And it got to the point of applying to jobs that were much more junior to my experience level and not saying that in a cocky or arrogant way. It was just
mm,
literally I was applying to jobs that I had 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I was getting turned down for them, and a lot of times people were saying like, "Oh, well, maybe you weren't getting it because you were overqualified." I was getting interviews for them, so it wasn't like I wasn't getting interviews or they were turning me down for salary. Like, I was literally getting turned down because I had one job that, turned me down because, like, they wanted somebody who had, 10 years in hotels, and I had 9 years in hotels, but I had, like, 16 years of experience. And it was, like, down to that, and I was like, "Okay, what did you think that extra year was gonna do me?"
yeah.
we're not talking about like, "Oh, I had 1 year of experience and you're looking for somebody who had 20 years of experience." That's a different
Mm,
conversation. But it was like that granular where I was getting turned down for things, on minutia. And I remember thinking at the beginning of this year, like, it's kinda how a lot of people feel about renting an apartment or leasing a car. Like, they spend all this money, but they're not getting anything at the end of it. They have to give back that apartment or give back that car. That's
mm,
kinda how I felt about applying for jobs. I spent a year of my life applying for jobs, interviewing, networking, reaching out to my network, like anything, volunteering, anything you could possibly think of to find work. Like, I thought I had it down to a science, and I had nothing to show for it at the end of the year. I didn't have a job, I didn't have a salary, I didn't have, one more year, one more company on my resume. And I got to the point where I kind of felt like people feel about apartments and leases. Like, I got nothing out of this year. I had nothing to show for it. And that's when, a couple months ago, I decided to look into setting up my own LLC and consulting privately on my own because I was like, even if I only get one customer out of it or one account or one scenario, it's still one more than I got in the last year of my life. And um, I was never the person who wanted to work on their own or thought like I'm an entrepreneur or like I want to start my own business or I have this great idea. I was never that person. I was content working in house and working for a corporation because like it was always a mind frame of it's easier to go into a fully formed company, that's already ironed out all the kinks, and you
yeah.
go, you get your salary, you get your benefits, and you just need to kind of learn your job. But
Mm,
then it wasn't easier anymore. Like, at some point, it became just as difficult to get a job in a fully formed company than
right.
it was equally as hard to do that as it was to start your own company. So I was like, if it's gonna be hard regardless, I might
Yeah.
as
Might as
well,
well start my own.
yeah, do something on my own and not just
Yeah.
wait around for,
Mm.
somebody to throw me a bone. So
Yeah, and the same thing applies, I think, like in, we often think that working in a corporation gives us a security, right? A job security, salary security. We don't have to necessarily worry about like, whether we're going to get a paycheck the next month. But with something like hospitality in this field, it's so volatile. The thing is, it's like you build all your skills, all your expertise, all your experience towards, being a master in this field. And then if you have something like a pandemic hit, you're like, how do I even, where can I even transfer these skills? Like, I can't take my skill set and work in a bank now. It is very tricky. It really is.
yeah, and it's funny you say that because, like, tech was something that I tried to transfer over to because working in sales, it wasn't something where I was in a profession that was very niche in the standpoint of like an accountant. Accountants are very specialized in this type of finance that they're focusing in. Like, if you're a podiatrist, you're not all of a sudden going to start, doing brain surgery without an extra prep. But in sales, it's like, yeah, there's a learning curve, if you're in a different industry where you have to learn, the new industry, but it's still sales. Like it's still you just need to understand your product. And I like I said earlier, where like I would be applying for jobs that like were saying 1 year of experience. And this was me recently. Like I was applying for jobs in the tech industry that said entry level or like 1 year of experience. And I would interview for them and do great in the interview. And every single time they'd come back and be like, you don't have any experience in tech. And I'm like, but the job is 1 year experience. Like, what are you what are you expecting? Like, I have over 15 years of experience, and your job posting is saying a job that's a entry level position. Like, regardless of me, were you expecting somebody applying for your job with 1 year of experience to have this tech and, industry experience? So it was just like this double-edged sword that you just couldn't win it. I was like, "I have 15 more years of experience than you're requiring, but you're holding me to the fact that I don't have tech experience," when it's really, like, not like, you just need to learn the product, not that big of a deal, but it definitely feels like this boys club in the tech industry of like, "Oh, you couldn't understand what we're doing," and I'm like, couldn't I though? Like,
Yeah, exactly. Can you tell me a little bit about like experience of rejection for you and what effect it had on your mental health?
sure, sure. It's funny because I had that conversation with my mom recently, and she's like, "This must be very disheartening." And I was like, "Yeah, I guess, yeah, it is. I'm not discrediting that whatsoever. I think it would have been more difficult for me if this was going on in my early 20s or, when I was younger. But at
Hmm.
this point, I definitely have the mind frame of like, what's wrong with those guys, you know?"
Love
Um,
it.
and so, like, it kind of like, do I roll my eyes? 100%. But, like, do I move on? Like, I don't let it, like, keep me down, but I think that that's also age, wisdom, experience, all this stuff, and also during the pandemic, I tried to, change how I responded to things. So I was very much like that New Yorker personality of, like, quick-tempered, quick to respond to things, like,
Hmm.
very reactive, and I didn't necessarily like that about myself. And while I will never be a mellow person by any stretch of the imagination, I do try to be mindful of like taking a step back and like noticing how I am responding to things. So I also try to change the lifestyle as well. Like I know what my triggers are. If I'm in a rush or I get lost when I'm driving someplace or like I can't find my keys, like those little things are little, but like those are the things that set me off. So, like, I try to accommodate for those things that I know that can, like, annoy me.
Right.
So, like, I slow down a little bit, I give myself more time, I put things in a certain place so I always know where they are, and it's definitely helped me with my reaction, to those little things, but also the bigger things, because I can be that person that I can handle a lot, I'll handle a lot, like, I'll get a rejection, I'll get a this, I'll get a that, negative news, and I'll handle it fine, and then all of a sudden I can't find my keys and I will lose my mind, because it's, like, only so much that, like, somebody can keep handling or whatever,
Yeah.
but kind of slowing down a little bit, changing a lifestyle, like eating a little bit healthier, exercising more, uh,
Hmm.
meditating, just doing little things. Now, again, nobody would call me mellow. Nobody would say, "Oh, there's a mellow person." But like
Yeah.
for me and how I handle things and respond to things, there has been a big difference from like pre-pandemic when I wasn't doing any of this stuff to
Hmm.
now of like things that happen in my personal life and then also applying to jobs and getting all of this rejection and stuff.
You mentioned earlier though that you kind of like chalked it down to a science. So walk me through like the science. What did you learn objectively from this whole process of job interviews and
Starting my career during a recession, you kind of had to figure some things out. I tried to volunteer, so like I was keeping busy, I was networking, it was something that I could put on my resume. And hopefully certain connections could lead to something. I was tapping into my personal network. I am somebody who keeps things close to the vest. I'm not somebody who like airs my dirty laundry or tells everybody every single thing about me. So like that was also difficult for me because having to look for work and look for work so long, there's a stigma to it. And so having those conversations with people, while difficult for me and not my preference, I have had people that finally, when I opened up, said, "I talked to my friend for you," or, like, "I, reached out to this person or check into this. I know they're hiring," so they may either make a connection for you or give you some advice that you didn't think of beforehand. So, like, even down opening up a little bit more with people I knew,
mm,
reaching out to my professional network, down to applying. I've at times used a professional resume writer. I've reached out to recruiters to review my resume to see that it looks good. I've done keywords in my resume. I anything you could possibly think of. I probably have thought about it at some point or tried to do it. Now,
mm,
do I have it down to a literal science? No, but some things I try to do in the interview is like
mm,
research a person that I'm connecting with prior. And I can't tell you how many times just saying something little like one person was from a certain area and I had gone there years ago and I said, "Oh, you're from," say it was Detroit or whatever. And I was like, "Oh, I went to Detroit years ago. I went to the Motown Museum. I really loved it. I got barbecue down the road." I mean, I mentioned the barbecue place and like I've had interviewers say to me like, "Oh, wow, I've never had somebody like, make that kind of connection or, research me like that before." And like research, a lot of times people will research in the standpoint of like, "Oh, what is your professional background?" Like what does your LinkedIn say? And they'll connect on the, "Oh, you worked at Ernst and Young or wherever, wherever," and they'll make that type of connection. But a lot of times people won't go out of their way to make that personal connection. And a lot of times that personal connection is what people relate to more when you're having a
Mm.
conversation with them. So, if I can make that connection, I do find that that kind of leads a conversation off on a right foot.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I feel like you said so many important things here because I feel like, especially when it comes to, career, there is a lot of talk now on mental health about being vulnerable and being open about your personal life and stuff because, there is a lot more support than we know there is to be. But it's still not that kind of conversation in business. We still don't have those kind of conversations in corporation, in the corporate world. And so when you mentioned that, those few times that you opened up and, shared some of the things that we think are very stigmatized, it actually people do can relate a lot more than we think they can. And being just honest about what your situation is, more likely that the person is going to feel connected to you and want to help you more than otherwise. I think the idea of like not having a gap on our CV is such a difficult thing to sort of like be in today's world because it's
Yeah.
like, well, why didn't you work? Like, did you have an issue? Would you, or do you have problems that we should be aware of? Maybe it is okay to be like, yeah, I didn't work for a year. I wanted to take a year to just do some self love, self care, like self discovery, and that's it. I had a difficult time and I took a year off, and it could be actually very, very beneficial to sort of share that aspect of us, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I find that, like, knowing the time and the place for certain things, and that's always been big, and because, like, I veered towards the extreme of just, like, not having those, candid conversations, but, like, knowing you can have them, but when is the right time and place to have them, I find is
Mm.
very important of, like,
Yeah.
you don't wanna overshare in the wrong situation, but, like, undersharing could also be a
Mm.
well if people like don't understand and it's like just having those candid conversations sometimes adults need the explanation of like yes this is why this happened and here's a backstory on it and
Mm.
that can be vital for getting it off your own chest but also like if somebody is being critical or whatever maybe they'll take a step back of like okay this is where I'm at
And also, it is kind of unrealistic for companies to expect every individual that's applying to be like perfect, right? I mean, surely they do know that everyone comes with their own baggage, whatever that baggage is, right? And they're in a way trying to suss out how comfortable are you about, how confident are you about, sharing who you are and what baggage you sort of come with. And yet sort of like, and when you are able to sort of share like, hey, look, like I struggle in these particular areas, but this is why I want to work with you guys, because I feel like these other areas are very much aligned. And, I feel so connected to you guys on a deeper level that you actually kind of become more relatable to even the interviewer.
Yeah, I saw a cartoon on LinkedIn the other day and it was like, picture of a job seeker and it said like they had 49 out of 50 of the requirements and then the recruiter it said, underneath that their picture it said, I found a great candidate or great candidates and then next to them was the hiring manager that said, "I'm going to need more candidates." And it was just like so funny, but it was true where like a lot
Yeah.
of times these hiring managers, expect perfection of like, yeah, like maybe there was like one thing out of your list of skills that they didn't have, but was it the most important skill? Was it something that they could, was transferable? Was it something that
Hmm.
they, could learn on the fly. Like, for instance, I'm very good at learning new technology. So, like, I've had to use a lot of CRMs like Salesforce and HubSpot and a lot of different
Mm.
ones. I've had to learn six with four different companies. Just recently, I
Wow.
taught myself a seventh. And, I taught myself it in a matter of days. I was like up and running on it. And so
Right.
a lot of times things like that, it's like that may be a checkbox against me, like, oh, she hasn't worked with this specific platform before.
Mm.
Sure, but, like, I also can teach myself that platform very, very quick, and I've done so with 7 other platforms. So,
Right.
sometimes things like that, people are not, they're just looking at the black and white, and they're not looking at the bigger picture.
Tell me a little bit about this job of yours, this company you started.
Sure, sure. So, like I was mentioning earlier, I've done all sorts of events for all sorts of, industries, social, corporate, things like that.
Yeah.
But much of my background has been in the corporate event planning. So whether that is just straight meetings, if that's
Right.
the C-suite needing an executive, meeting, or if it's a all hands on deck training, and everything in
Mm.
between, or if it's a quarterly meeting, quarterly sales meeting, I am the person who helps you with the logistics, so the back end stuff. So it's a twofold situation. So some people just need the planning on the back end. So, like, hey, I just don't have the time or the capacity to figure out like venue sourcing, vendor sourcing, contract negotiation,
Hmm.
menu selections if it's like an all day event and they're having meals in between, if they're also having excursions, or, we're going to have an offsite, after the event, and, I need to plan that as well. So I handle all of the logistics, in and around that event.
Right.
There's also a travel component to it as well. So if people are like, hey, can you also help me with the travel logistics to and from the event? Hiring a car, or,
Mm.
airfares, or, needing to stay in hotels, things like that. So it's kind of like a all-encompassing start to finish, and then they can either do the pre-planning package or the production package. So if they're like, we need somebody on site to actually execute, the setup of things, make sure somebody's overseeing the setup, and check-in process and everything is going off without a hitch. I also offer that as well. So people can just do the planning portion if that's all they need, or if they need the production side of it as well.
Mm.
Kind of just
Obviously.
twofold package. That's what I liked about events. I knew I was not the person who wanted to be sitting staring at a screen for 40, 50, 60 hours a week. But after working, as you well know, in operations, working sometimes standing 15, 16, 17-hour days, I was like, I don't think I can do that anymore either. So it's like with events, it's that happy middle of administrative work of, you have to do the logistics of it, but you're also out and about, executing things, meeting with customers. So it's kind of that happy middle ground for me of like,
Mm.
yeah, it's sedentary to an extra extent, but it's also up and about and mingling with the customers,
Mm.
executing logistics and things like that. So it was
Yeah.
perfect for my personality of, don't want to stand all the
Yeah.
time, don't want to sit all the time.
So Tracy, can you give like last plugins, last messages to anyone listening to this episode today?
Yeah, yeah. I guess if anybody needs, event planning or production services, or even you just want to hash out details or have questions, happy to do so. My website is chasingwonderful.com, and all my contact information and information on the business is up there as well. So happy to be a resource, or, just discuss or be a partner in your next event.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your time on the podcast. It's been so much fun speaking with you today.
Yeah, yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Stefan Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jenica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.